Really appreciate you all joining us today. What you might have seen is we are recording this session because we think it might be useful to share back with you, but also share with maybe wider colleagues who haven't been able to attend today as well. We do really appreciate your time today. We always find it helpful to be able to provide feedback. Whilst during this session, we won't necessarily be able to provide individual feedback on individual applications. We have spent quite a bit of time going through the portfolio that we'd received and being able to pick out key areas of strengths and areas where applications tended to do less well. What I would say is it was broadly a high-performing portfolio, and there were some real tough decisions that we had to make. But being able to go through some of those and present to you where we're at now and open up for questions will be really good. We have a bit of a presentation that we'll go through with you to remind you of the themes of the round and what we were trying to achieve, and then go into a bit more broad around more broad kind of feedback to share with you. We'll stop after each of the sections to be able to answer questions. If you want to put your questions in the chat, that will be really helpful. Kaylin is online today, our colleague who will be helping Yasmin and I in terms of being able to manage those questions and answering as many of those as possible. So we will make sure that we do that as well. If we do run out of time, or if there's something you think of afterwards, please feel free to reach out to the grants inbox that we have, which is grants@youthendowmentfund.org.uk, and we will do our best to answer any of those additional questions. As I say, it's really difficult for us to give individualized feedback, but we can do something more broadly if that is helpful. I think outside of that, whilst we're presenting, it's always helpful to have people, if possible, on mute, so there's no background feedback. But feel free, if you don't want to put your questions in the chat box, to put your hand up when we do stop, and we will indicate when we've stopped and are open for questions for you to be able to take those. Yasmin and I will be delivering today's session. So those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Fullick. I am Head of Programmes at the Youth Endowment Fund and have been here for over 2.5 years. And my team is responsible for working collaboratively across YEF to be able to set up specific themed grant rounds and manage our portfolio of grantees and evaluations linked to that. Yasmin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Yasmin. I'm a Programme Manager at the Youth Endowment Fund. I've been here just over 2 years now and will be co-leading this grant round 5.
Thanks, Yasmin. Kaylin, you are always a great support to us in the team, so would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Kaylin and I'm part of the operations team, and I'm assisting Sarah and Yasmin on this workshop today.
Fantastic, that's great. So Yasmin's going to be the technical one of us today in terms of presenting and talking through some of the slides as well, but I will start off, and Yasmin, if you could share the slides for us, that would be great. Thank you. So, as I said, what we wanted to do first is just to reset the scene. So what are we trying to do with positive activities within this theme grant round, and how did we assess it? How does it fit in with our strategy, and what does that look like in practice? So many of you would have seen this diagram before, and this is key to our mission, or to ensuring that we can work towards achieving our mission and our vision as an organisation as well, which is essentially for us to be able to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence. Now, to do that, we have a number of focus areas that you can see in the red box, our priority focus areas on the left-hand side. Knowing that the area of youth crime and violence is so broad, we really wanted to hone in and focus on some key priority areas. We do have some flex and scope to be able to move in and out of those where we need to, so we ensure that we're not being too myopic in our approach. However, these are some of the areas where some of the evidence gaps we feel that we're able to make real progress in. So we take those priority areas and we set ourselves up to be able to run multiple grant rounds, to be able to tackle some of the key research questions and evidence gaps that we've found. So to do that, we work really hard to fund good work. So for us, on the blue column you can see there, that is particularly around running grant rounds, whether that be themed grant rounds, which grant round 5, positive activities, is one of those themes, place-based or targeted projects. There are many other things we do in that area, in that blue column, but predominantly that's where the programmes team focus, and that's where positive activities sits. Once we've been able to identify promising projects, so really find good work to be able to test, We then want to see whether it works or not. So we take those promising projects, we take those applications or applicants, and we move to the next stage where we can then pair them with evaluators and design rigorous impact designs to test whether that particular project is effective in having a positive impact against some of the primary and secondary outcomes we are most interested in as an organisation. That in and of itself is not enough. So we take that, we take promising projects, we test them to see whether they work for who in what circumstances. And then we take that information alongside our wider research activities and additional work that we do across the sector, working with key stakeholders and practitioners to help us inform policy and practice. And we take all of that forward and use that to help shape future policy, to understand what works, where money should go, what commissioning should look like, and really try and connect people to the evidence base to ensure that we have an informed approach. Obviously, there's much more work that fits in and around our strategy, but that is predominantly where positive activities fits into that. And of course, we can't do that alone. As an organisation, we're here to help generate evidence and help inform what works, or understand what works for who and what circumstances, and help shape the sector in that way. But we can only do that in partnership and working in coalitions with organisations that work across the youth sector, statutory organisations, charities, those that work in education, local authorities, and so on. So coming together and generating that movement and set of partnerships to enable us to push forward with our mission. Thanks, Jasmine. So taking that into account, why are we here today? So we really appreciate that our grant rounds take an awful lot of time and effort to be able to apply for, given the fact that we're trying to find the most promising projects and put them through impact design evaluations. So we're really keen that although we have a wealth of applications that come through, that we make time to ensure that we can provide feedback to our applicants so we can discuss what made strong applications, or those applications that tended to do less well, what did they look like and why. I think it's really clear, or really clear to us anyway, and we're really keen to impart that often there are really small margins. And actually our portfolio that we end up granting is pretty small compared to the number of applications we get through. We don't want that to discourage people. We want people still to be able to work with us and reach out to us through our theme grant rounds, and use these sessions to really help them tweak around the edges, those margins, to ensure that they're the strongest applications that they can be. Thanks, Jasmine. So why are we here today? So again, positive activities. This is the grant round that we opened earlier this year, and we're now moving into the next stages of theory of change work and co-design. But what do we mean by positive activities? And that was our first kind of port of call, really being able to set that out. And for this themed grant round, we talked about positive activities in the scope of sports, arts, and wilderness and adventure activities that lead to improved violent offending outcomes for young people and children, primarily aged 10 to 18, and who are at high risk of being affected by violence, offending, and or exploitation. Thanks, Jasmine. What does that look like in practice? So we talked at length about what this could mean, and we understood that sports and the arts in particular could be standalone activities. For example, you could go to a boxing club, you could go to a football club, you could go to a dance club, or some form of kind of arts activity in and of its own right. And we could look at those activities to see whether they have a potential positive impact for the lives of the young people we're here to serve. But equally, there is also a use for positive activities as a hook. So what we mean by that is being able to use positive activities, whether it be sports or arts, to be able to engage young people in wider activities such as mentoring, maybe therapies, and give them that wider support, and use positive activities as that wraparound engagement tool. We wanted to make sure that all of the activities that we deliver within positive activities were clearly structured, they were consistent in their delivery, and they were regular and facilitated by appropriately trained practitioners, whether they be paid or volunteered. We know both workforces are essential in the youth sector and the work that we do. Delivery must primarily have been to young people 10 to 18 years, with a little bit of wriggle room within that, as discussed in the application guidance, and really primarily focused on reducing those violent offending behaviours and having a clear idea of what intensity and duration look like, i.e. what is the dosage, what does that young person receive, and how much of it do they receive. Thanks, Jasmine. we'd kind of broadly touched on this as well. So we set out what positive activities was and what we wanted to focus on for this round, but it's really important for us then to say who we wanted this round to reach and what does that look like in practice. And there were really two broad groups that we were particularly interested in. So we talked about those who are at high risk of being affected by violence, offending or exploitation. And we talked about those who are also potentially within the system already itself. So we'd said that we wanted to work with children and young people, primarily aged 10 to 18, that had one or more of the following characteristics. So they were either already involved in the youth justice system, either in a custodial or community-based setting. We termed that as tertiary prevention or tertiary level of need. Or they're considered at risk of involvement in youth offending, which we suggested is more of a secondary level of need. And by at risk, we meant individual, familial or geographical reasons. Being affiliated with groups involved in crime, violence and trafficking, sometimes termed as gangs, although we try not to use that terminology so much. Or those being affected by serious violence, criminal or sexual exploitation as either predators or perpetrators, or victims. Thanks, Yasmin. So essentially that gave us our round, and that was the infrastructure for the round. So being able to really find out whether positive activities delivered in and of their own right, so standalone, could make a difference to the lives of young people and the outcomes we're most interested in. Can positive activities, when they're delivered as a hook to something else, such as mentoring or therapies or employment, could that be have a positive impact or be effective in driving those positive outcomes? And then more broadly, when looking at wilderness and adventure activities, could that also have some form of positive impact? The other thing that we were particularly interested in as well is understanding the difference between local and national delivery. And I will come on to that shortly when we start to talk about some of the information around our multi-site trials that we've been running alongside this grant round as well. Thanks, Yasmin. So what did it look like in total, and how many applications did we have through? So we had 126 applications. Our assessors assessed all of those at least once, with 75% of our applications going through what we call double scoring. So we have that as part of our quality assurance and quality control, along with a number of other measures. From the 126, what we call long listed 21. So we identified 21 projects and organisations that we were really interested in digging into a bit further. Our evaluation team then reviewed those 21 in more detail through the lens of our evaluation requirements. And through that, we shortlisted 10 projects and organisations to be shortlisted and interviewed. And we invited those 10 to come to interview. Of those 10, 5 are moving through to the next stages of theory of change and co-design, which is the next step to be able to understand what type of evaluation design we hope to do and we hope will come to fruition through the next stages. Thanks, Yasmin. But what did assessment look like in general? And I think those of you who may have attended the application workshops will know that we have 2 broad buckets of assessment criteria, with 7 assessment criteria in total that are split between those. So firstly, we want to understand whether there's a great plan. So is the project promising? And then secondly, we want to understand the strong capability to be able to deliver the size and scale we need the projects to deliver to be able to do impact designs. Thanks, Yasmin. So what do we mean when we say a great plan? There's 4 key criteria that we look at when we're talking about a great plan. So you would have known, and from looking at our guidance material, we talked a lot about the outcomes we were most interested in. Primarily, we were interested in some of our, or focused on our offending outcomes. They were the ones of greatest interest for us for this round. But there were some other outcomes that we were interested in, or could have been open to be interested in, as identified in the guidance. Now, those of you who've been on our website, you will hopefully have seen that we have a really strong outcomes framework that identifies all of the outcomes that we could be interested in or are interested in as an organisation. For each of the theme rounds, we look at that framework and we really understand where we believe we can make the best inroads in terms of evidence generation against those outcomes by that grant round. And as we are here to try and improve the positive outcomes in the lives of young people in relation to crime and violence, we like to understand how we can potentially shift some of the offending outcomes and those that are associated with it. So that was the first assessment criteria that we were really keen to look at. We then really wanted to understand whether the projects that had been submitted to us were able to deliver to the achieved proposed outcomes. So what do we mean by that? Essentially, we're trying to say, are you able to, or if you are able to deliver your outcome or able to deliver your activities outlined in your proposal, is it likely that it could lead to those proposed outcomes? And what is your track record or experience of being able to do that in terms of working with teams of practitioners, training and supervising practitioners, as well as being able to support support to wider staff members, and also understanding the lives and potential challenges that the young people that you want to support face, and what that means in practice, and identify key risks and mitigations. I think that's really key. I'm always concerned if I don't see any risks identified or mitigations, especially with the cohort of young people that we're most interested working with, because we always know that any project, even without an evaluation, has or comes with potential risks, and how we mitigate those are really important. I think it's also really important to note that even if something is high risk, actually, if we believe it's been sufficiently mitigated against, that's something that we see as a positive. So again, just having that clarity of understanding of where we're coming with that may also be useful. The next criteria is able to engage the right type of young people. So when we talk about the right type of young people, it's really understanding, is the project designed to, or could it reach the young people we are most interested in for this funding round? So that is a few slides back where we identified the young people we wanted to work with. So we are always keen to ensure that the projects that align best to that are the ones that will predominantly have our focus alongside the other assessment criteria. The next criteria that we look at is potential for high quality evaluation. So essentially, is it possible to be able to do a randomized control trial or other rigorous evaluation that is at our disposal? It's worth noting that a randomized control trial will always be our main focus, unless there's a reason that it is not appropriate for us to use that. But for the most part, a randomized control trial is the best type of evaluation design for us to use for those that we are working with. So really understanding the potential for high quality evaluation. Could we put the project that's being presented to us in the application through a rigorous evaluation to really understand whether it could be effective for changing the dial against some of the outcomes that we're most interested in as an organisation? And if so, would it allow us to really understand whether any of those changes can be attributable to that project itself? Thanks, Yasmin. So strong potential to look at evaluation. So the next three criteria start to dig into what we mean by strong evaluation potential more so. So it's capability to really be able to deliver in the way that we need you to be able to run an impact evaluation. And we are very aware that being able to deliver a project within the context of an impact evaluation is challenging and it is tricky. So really understanding whether a project is able to do that well is super important to ensure that we protect the project, but also the organisation and their partnerships, as well as the young people we're here to work with as well. So is it possible that the project can reach the required scale? So the number of young people that we were able to outline. For the first time in the theme grant rounds, I think we had greater clarity in the numbers in which we expected projects to reach than ever before. Now that's super helpful, and we've been able to do that building on prior information from our existing funding rounds or grant rounds that are in flight currently at the minute. And that has allowed us to give better parameters on what we expect in terms of number of young people that we might need to reach at this stage to be able to understand whether any change in the project or any change in outcomes can be attributed to the project. So sample size is really important. Although we appreciate that the numbers of young people being reached will be refined in the next stages, giving an indication of what that might look like is really important. Alongside that is really understanding not just the numbers that are being given, but the likelihood of projects to be able to reach those numbers. So we look at whether projects are delivered large-scale evaluations or projects previously. If they haven't, are they able to set up partnerships? Do they have partners? Do they have credible ideas as to how they might reach those numbers in a way that seems sensible and mitigates risk? So we take all of that into consideration. The next outcome or the next assessment criteria that really links, I think, to criteria 2 in the previous slide as well, is really understanding that if you have your projects being delivered by a high quality team, so you have your staff in place, they're trained, they understand the young people, you clearly have worked in those spaces before, do the activities that you've outlined seem reasonable, that if they're delivered exceptionally well, you will get a change in that outcome? So what we're essentially saying is the activities you've proposed that you've outlined in your application, if they're delivered well, is there either evidence, existing evidence, is there academic literature, is there something pragmatic that we can pull on that would suggest those activities will definitely or could have the potential to definitely lead to change in those outcomes? And again, that's really important to understand how those activities might lead to change in those outcomes. And then more broadly, outside of the delivery of the project specifically for the funding round, we're always keen to understand how likely something is to lead to change. So if we find that a project works brilliantly and we've tested it through an impact evaluation and it shows fantastic results, so what do we do next? So we have to understand if that is the case, or if we have some really exciting information that comes out of the evaluation, how do we use that to influence policy and practice at scale, and what does that look like? And we take that into account and we talk about, if you remember, are you able to scale up as an organisation? Could you train others? Do you think this could cause a change in policy or practice? So we take that into account also. And collectively, those 7 assessment criteria are used to help us score the applications, and we use that to feed into our decisions. Thanks, Yasmin. Our race equity commitment, or our commitment to equality, you would have seen that we've in the last 12 months or so been really pushing forward with our race equity, diversity and inclusion commitments, and that's something we take really seriously within our funding, and that is no different within our themed grant rounds. We know that there are children from marginalised backgrounds that are either significantly overrepresented in the youth justice system and sometimes find it difficult to engage with services and activities that are delivered by our projects or service providers more broadly. So we need to make sure that our funding reaches young people and those that are marginalised or disproportionately represented in the youth justice system. We also need to be sure that what is being presented to us recognises some of the challenges diverse groups may face when accessing projects and activities, and sufficiently address those as well. So taking this together, we use this to help us make our decisions when we're looking at assessments. In practical terms, what that means is we commit to working with organisations that are Black, Asian or minority ethnic led, and that for us is having a leadership, so that's both in the organisation and the board, with more than 50% of their leaders identifying as Black, Asian or minority ethnic. That's really important to us, that we can build capacity within those organisations. And we also have a commitment towards ensuring that our projects reach diverse communities. And we work really hard with our applicants all the way through the process and our grantees to ensure that we're able to do that, to gather more learning about what works for who and in what circumstances. That has also led to something that has taken place in parallel with the Grant Round 5 themed grant round, positive activities. We have also been working on what we call multi-site trials, where we have been working with organisations who reach a number of smaller organisations who in and of their own right may not have been able to run a randomised control trial, but we're looking at the power of bringing those sites and organisations together to be able to run a multi-site trial. We're already running one of those successfully, and Yasmin manages that in our mentoring area, but we're also looking at it in positive activities. That sits slightly differently, or it sits outside of the theme grant round itself. but we are trying to ensure that we build that capability and capacity into working with organisations of different sizes and those with more diverse leadership. Thanks, Yasmin. What does it look like in terms of what we're trying to achieve in terms of our evaluation, and what did we want to do for this round? So those of you, again, who will have known, and those of you who will have seen in our guidance, we are pushing really hard to understand whether we can run impact trials for positive activities. What does that mean? So the 10 steps that some of you may be very, very familiar with, we really want to understand whether we can predominantly aim for step 6 or step 7. And yes, I think that would be really, sorry, just seeing a comment come up. Yes, there will be a recording of the session made, and we will go through some of the questions shortly. We're really focusing on testing step 6, which is testing for efficacy. So what we mean by that is doing randomized control trials or quasi-experimental designs. That will be something we aim for, and where possible, pushing for step 7. However, we appreciated that in the field of positive activities, there are some projects that may not be ready to go straight into efficacy. But we've pushed really hard to start with what we call internal pilots in some cases, not in all, but in some, which means that we're able to do a very small scale randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design to see whether we're able to deliver the project within the context of that type of design, with the idea of very quickly scaling up to an efficacy study. Why is that important? Well, the reason it's important is our step 6 and step 7 allow us to test for impact. So we are able to see whether a change may or may not happen within a project, and if it does, can it be attributable to the project itself? And that's really important for us to understand the difference a project can make. Thanks, Yasmin. So actually, if we just go back one, just before we hand over to Yasmin and start to go through some of the areas where applications did really well and some of the areas where they did less well, I don't know whether there's any particular questions, just setting that scene before we go into those next bits. I've just seen a question pop up that says, what is the difference between step 6 and step 7? That is an excellent question. I'll answer that first, Kaylin, before handing over to you to read the others out to me. So efficacy and effectiveness are really, there's small differences in them. So efficacy is what we call ideal conditions. So it's much smaller scale, randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design. And you do it in such a way where you can control as many of the conditions as possible. So if we were to do it really simply, it'd be something that you could do in a laboratory, or something you could do in the smallest number of areas that you're delivering. So it's easier to control some of those external factors that can affect delivery. Once you've found out at stage 6 that there's potential promise, there's potential positive impact, you then scale up to effectiveness. So what that basically means is running the randomized control trial again, or the quasi-experimental trial, quasi-experimental design again, but you do it at much larger scale, knowing that some of those conditions you controlled for before are going to be harder to control for. So you're then delivering it in what you would call real life situation. What does it look like when you're unable to be quite as systematic as you are at step 6? Do you still get a positive result? Sometimes those results are smaller than you see it at stage 6 because you can't control for everything. But what you want to see is that trajectory going in the similar direction. So one's more kind of idealistic in terms of its delivery and much more controlled. And another one is more like in a real world kind of setting, if that makes sense.
Sarah, we've got a question from Steve asking, when do you expect to have enough data and sets of outcome for the toolkit to then be able to open up the funding streams for applications generally alongside your desired areas of focus? Thanks.
So is that more broadly maybe filling some of the gaps that we said we could talk about? I think that's what that might be picking at. Actually, I would say, although I don't think we can say too much yet, I would say the next grant round or two, keep an eye out. We're already starting to consider, because you know now that we positive activities, we will have gone into our 5th themed grant round. And we've already started to look at, are there potential gaps in which we've missed within those themed grant rounds? And yes, we have, because we've not been able to fund everything, or some things haven't quite worked in the way that we needed them to or wanted them to. So we've had to flip and change. I would say keep an eye out over the next few months to see what's coming. It will definitely be pretty soon in terms of how we identify where we may have gaps in our current portfolio and our evidence base within our toolkit, and how we intend to address those through another grant round. So I think it was Steve, was it? Yeah, Steve, keep an eye out and keep on logged on if you aren't already to our newsletter, because I think something will come out over the coming months. It'll be reasonably quick. When I say quick, probably over the next 2 to 3 months.
I'll pop a link in the chat to sign up to our newsletter for everyone, in case anyone's not subscribed to that. And then we'll just finish off with Lindsay's question, building on this the efficacy question before we move on to the next bit. So Lindsay's asking, for completeness, can you define the feasibility study?
Yeah, so I can just define feasibility and pilot. So feasibility study, often what we use a feasibility study for, if you see a theory of change, and I think most of you will be hopefully au fait with theories of change. So what you'll have is the reason why you're doing it, and then going into, for example, the inputs that you might have, so funding, partnerships, that type of stuff, your activities, then it goes to outputs and outcomes and impact. Actually, the feasibility allows us to test more of that left-hand side. So do the inputs and the activities stand true, and are they delivering the outputs that we intend for them to deliver? So we're not necessarily looking at impact, we're not necessarily looking at outcome, we're testing, does the project seem to work in the way in which we intended it to? So do the activities work? Are the inputs as expected? Does delivery look like it should? That's really important, because as you get further up the steps, we have something that we call kind of consistency and fidelity. So what we mean by that is as you get to the point where we start to put something into an impact design, delivery has to be pretty static in terms of what's being delivered, or consistent to what is being delivered to young people. The feasibility section allows us to explore delivery and understand what that kind of dosage in terms of length, frequency, duration that young people should really get, and what does that look like in practice. So you're really being able to test that part of the framework and then solidify that as a team. We're also then able to build on that and be able to understand, would it seem sensible, therefore, based on what we've seen delivered, that the outcomes that have been identified as part of the theory change seem right and accurate, and you can tweak those as necessary as well. So it then gives you a platform to then be able to say, okay, we think now by going through a feasibility, our project is pretty stable and can be delivered in the way that we want, and we now may be ready for a pilot. The difference between a pilot or several pilots, you can have what we call pre-post pilot, which is where you don't have a control condition, so you don't have anything to test it against, but you can use measures at the beginning or just before the beginning of the intervention at the end. Although you can't necessarily determine impact, or you can't say whether any impacts that you have observed within the pre-post design can be attributable to the project, what you can say is whether there is any promise, whether you've seen the measures that you've taken against the outcomes for those young people, have they changed over time? And on that basis, is it reasonable to assume that the project therefore could be promising? If that is the case, then you can also have the premise of saying, okay, we've done pre-post designs in a pilot, it looks like there could be some promise there. What we can't do yet is attribute that change to the project itself. So you would then go into running a test for efficacy, so step 6 or step 7. But sometimes what we'll do is we'll do a 5.5 where we'll do what we call a pilot efficacy. So we'll do a very small scale delivery of the project in the context of an impact design, so a randomized controlled trial or QED, quasi-experimental design, sorry, to see whether it can be delivered in that way without causing any negative impacts, and whether we can collect the data we need before then pushing forward to a larger scale to get the numbers we need to determine impact. I hope that's useful, but if there's anything more you need, let me know. I'd be more than happy to explain more. I think now it might be over to you though, Yasmin.
Thanks, Sarah. And just to make sure we keep on top of time, I know we've got about 20 odd minutes left, so I'll go through this very promptly, but if you've got leave time for questions at the end, so if you have anything particularly you want to ask on the basis of this feedback. As Sarah mentioned, this round was very competitive and we had a lot of high quality submissions. And while we can't provide individual level feedback, there were some common areas across applications where I can talk through sort of what made a stronger application and what made one not as strong. So where applications did quite well was on being valuable and scalable. So if applications demonstrated prior evidence of their programme working or being acceptable by young people, and that could be in the form of informal feedback surveys from young people participating in their programme, or it could be in having experience of working with an evaluator before. It could also look like knowledge of evaluations and acceptance of evaluations, in particular to the way YEF approaches that. It could just be an understanding and a real want to understand the impact of your programmes and showing that willingness to engage in that work. They also had the potential to reach large numbers, either themselves or through partnerships. So in applications, it was really clear on the number that projects could reach in terms of children and young people. This was sometimes supported with evidence of the last year's numbers reached, and this could be broken down by socio-demographic data as well, which really helped it clear to us who the programme's looking to work with and what they'd previously delivered to. Also under a strong application was looking at outcomes. So where this was strongest was when there was really clear alignment with our outcomes of interest. In particular, as Sarah mentioned earlier, our violence-related outcomes for this round. There was evidence presented which showed potential for the core activities to really lead to that change in our outcomes of interest and real clarity of what was being delivered. And there was a reasonable link between delivery and achieving intended outcomes. So this was sometimes supported with a theory of change or logic model, which really showed how the elements of that delivery of the programme linked to some of them short-term outcomes and then the longer-term outcomes that they wanted to achieve. Where applications did sort of less well under assessment criteria number 6 was if delivered well, likely to achieve the outcome. Sometimes in applications, we saw that there was an unclear model of delivery, especially in proposed blended programmes, and the blended programmes were where one or more positive activities were being delivered. Sometimes when the theory of change was uploaded, it just wasn't aligned with our outcomes, the particular violence-related outcome. Sometimes interventions were not codified enough, and that means it wasn't clear what the intervention was being delivered was. And naturally, we wouldn't be able to evaluate something if we didn't know what it was we're evaluating, what activity was being delivered, especially in them blended programs. There was sometimes a lack of specificity around the length of the entire program and the frequency of delivery in hours and weeks, which meant there was a lack of clarity about the intensity of the intervention the young people were receiving, and sometimes this led to young people getting very different experiences across the program's delivery period. Again, with the difficulty of understanding them core elements, made it harder to understand what we'd be evaluating, and then meant in the long term, further project development and refinement would be needed. Able to engage the right number of young people. Sometimes it was unclear that target cohort of young people, e.g. the tertiary or secondary level cohort of young people. Where applications did well, as I mentioned, with the numbers reached, they provided us with some of that socio-demographic breakdown of the children and young people that the project was being aimed to be delivered to. So they provide percentages of children and young people they worked with in the secondary level versus tertiary level, and where they tended to get them referrals from. So whether it was the youth justice system for the tertiary level cohort compared to schools or social services or through local authorities. And sometimes there was an unclear or unknown eligibility criteria for the cohort of young people. Therefore, we didn't know exactly the target cohort of young people the programme was trying to be delivered to. Able to deliver at required scale was another area applications tend to do less well in. So the maximum number of young people able to reach was too low. And if it was low, there wasn't necessarily evidence to support that ability to increase reach. We saw applications do this well when they explained their network or used their network to demonstrate how they could reach into other regions or other local areas, the connections they had to increase the number. So even where sometimes data was supplied for the last year that didn't necessarily demonstrate the reach that we were looking for, if they were able to provide suitable strategies and thoughts around how they would increase that number that seemed realistic, that was also a positive too. Other areas of consideration, as Sarah mentioned, we take this very seriously around race equity. And we really wanted applications to demonstrate to us how they deliver in a culturally sensitive way, understanding what racial equitable delivery looks like across all partners, understanding the potential for young people from racialized groups to have different experiences. And this is also across different geographies as well, and different locations where interventions are being delivered. The implications for referrals, retention and dropout. Sometimes there's barriers in engagement across different ethnicity groups, and we want to see the strategies that organisations and programmes use to engage this cohort of young people, and any training needs across delivery staff that they receive or across the organisation as a whole. I think I've done that quite quickly, so I'm sure there's probably some questions based on that, so please feel free to fire away. Kane, you got some?
That was fantastic, Yasmin. Yeah, really quick. So we have one question from Aurelie. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. She says, I imagine you have a platform to assess the applications where potentially the reviewers added this classification next to questions or groups of questions. What would it take to export this and share it with us? It would be extremely helpful to understand where our shortcomings were. So Yasmin or Sarah, whoever's most comfortable.
Thanks, Kaylin. Yeah, it's not something we do as standard because it actually is quite a large undertaking to be able to do. So we don't provide individual level feedback for that reason. So absolutely appreciate it would be helpful, and maybe we can further fine tune some of these sessions that we put on in the future. But unfortunately, that wouldn't be something that we would be able to do. Maybe what we could do though is if there are any specific questions that people would have felt useful to have had, we always have application workshops. So if you think there was anything missing, or if you think there's something we could have done better, or how we could maybe weave in some of this feedback more so within our resources for future grant rounds, then we would be very much open to that.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I've just got a question in from Steve. Will you look to show not only toolkit impact to help you, but may there be showcasing of funded projects that would be useful to us all to understand their models of delivery?
That's an excellent question, Steve. That is really, really good. So I don't know whether people are aware, if they haven't really worked with us before as a partner or as part of a consortium, but when we do impact evaluations that do obviously support our evidence gaps within our toolkit, we also do what we call implementation evaluations as well. And more broadly, we look at implementation. So, it's notoriously difficult to turn the dial and impact on young people's outcomes, on outcomes in general. And there's only a small proportion across multiple sectors that run impact designs that will show positive impacts or strong positive impacts on those outcomes. That doesn't mean to say that if something hasn't shown an impact on those outcomes, that there aren't positive things that can be taken. And there's always lots that we see around models of delivery, around key ingredients that we would say would be really important. So for example, in mentoring, what are the key ingredients to mentoring that we believe are those integral active ingredients that we should be seeing across all of those projects. So they could be the types of things that we would share. One of the things, Steve, I'm thinking about as well is also how we share more broadly some of the work that we're doing with our funded projects already about some of those models. So what do they look like in practice? So although we might not be able to share impact yet, are there things around what good quality delivery looks like, what some of the core components we should expect to see, and how people can use that to further develop and refine their own practice as well. So I don't know whether that helps at all, but I think it's still a work in progress, but it is something that we do collect and we do use for the very reasons I think you were asking the question. There is a real wealth of insight and learning that we can take from everything that we do.
And Aurelie has just responded to say she's unable to see exactly, especially from what Yasmin said, where they scored a little bit less. So just a scoring in general might be helpful for the future. So just a pointer there, something to consider.
Let me take it back. I don't think it's something we can do for this round, but if there is a way that we could look at the systems, I can at least ask the question and see if it is something that we can review. So I do take that on board and absolutely hear it. Being on the other side of the fence as well, I know it's always helpful. So leave that with me and I'll take that on board.
Awesome. I've not seen any more questions. I can give everyone a minute if they want to pop some in. So until then, Yasmin or Sarah, is there anything extra you'd like to add in general?
Just in general, I just want to say a huge thank you, like the programs team and just as an organisation as a whole, the amount of effort that goes into completing our applications, we know is huge. We know it's resource intensive. And we set it up in a way that tries to get the balance to be as streamlined as possible, whilst also ensuring that we are able to support the most promising projects go through really complex and challenging evaluations. So we want to say that, you know, it is fine margins and there are small numbers that come through. It's really tough for us to make these decisions, like agonizingly tough for us to go through these decisions. And Yasmin, who's quite new to the programs team, will be able to attest to that with some of the work that she's done with this grant round as well. So I just want to say, A, massive thank you. We appreciate the amount of time and effort that goes into these, and B, the quality of what we receive is so good. It's just we're not always able to fund everything that we get through, but we are keen to make sure that we make feedback as purposeful as possible. But I just wanted to be really clear about how grateful we are to get those high quality applications in. That really gives us the most positive headache that we could have, which is more projects than we can afford to fund within some of the grant rounds. So yeah, I just wanted to say a big thank you. Yasmin, I don't know whether you have anything to add.
Just to echo what you said, Sarah, and apology if there wasn't overly clear sort of, you know, where them areas were that could have been stronger in the applications. And as Sarah said, it was very competitive and really hard to differentiate between the stronger ones, but the not so strong or somewhere in the middle ground. And it really was on that clarity of defining the program being delivered and how clear that came across to us, and particularly the cohort of young people being worked with in this funding round, because we are exploring them violent offending outcomes, and we are looking at working to that tertiary level cohort of need as well. So they were the two areas, so the ability to reach the right cohort of young people, and yeah. Sorry, Sarah, if there's something you want to add on that.
No. I was also going to say that you will always see in our guidance as well, and I think we've got better at this as we've grown as an organisation as well. We give clarity on what our key research questions are, so things we're most interested in for this grant round. And I think there was 5 that we identified in the 4 or 5 that we identified in the guidance. And we have to make sure that we have enough within our portfolio that we fund to answer those questions. So it's also making sure, you know, it could be, and we had some excellent arts, wilderness and adventure and sports activities, but we also had to make sure that we had enough of each to be able to answer some of those key questions. So again, it's making sure that balance enables us to answer those questions or gaps within our evidence base as well. And that is one of the reasons I think Steve asked the question earlier on, when will we be reviewing where there may be some gaps that we want to further address and go back to. That will be coming out shortly. And again, Steve, you are right. I saw a comment earlier when looking at scaling things up. They're the things now that we're starting to think around moving forward as well. How do we take some of the information that we're going through now to ensure that we can start to move into scale up activities when we find some of those things are working and working well. But it is really challenging, and we just want to say a big thank you. We know it's an immense effort to do this, and if there is anything else you can think of outside of the stuff you've already given us that you think could improve the experience, we are very open to hear it. So if you can't think of it now, or something comes to you later, or one of your team members or partners raises something, please do drop us a line. We are really keen to continue to refine our processes to be the best that we can be.
We have another question from Steve. Should you have great successes with this fund, would you be better placed to gain greater funding for scale delivery than when you first started on this journey?
Good question. So I guess that touches a lot on our re-granting strategy, right? So what does that look like in practice once we have organisations that have come through, and also our scalability strategy as well. So from a programmes perspective, as we go through each of the grant rounds and as the evaluations start to draw to a close and we have some conclusions, we do look at our portfolio and we do assess whether we believe we can take that project to the next stage. So it may be, if you remember those 10 steps, if we're working at effectiveness or efficiency, we take it to effectiveness, or we then take it further up to scalability and understand what that looks like. As we start to learn more and as we start to build or try and fill the gaps in the evidence, we will start to look more and more to scale up and what that looks like in practice. So there are several things that we think through. So we've got the re-granting strategy. There's some work that our change team are doing as well, which is how do we take some of those good things that we found and then understand what they look like at scale. And then you have other things that you need to take into that. What does delivery look like at scale? Who delivers it? How do we support it? So we are kind of now starting to move in those types of directions where we're still building evidence, but we're then trying to take the information around where we found things have worked really well and how we then scale those up. So both England and Wales can start to benefit from the information that we found. So you'll start seeing some of that work starting to come through now as well. But we are on the beginning of our journey with that. But if you are interested, there's quite a bit of work that our change team are doing who really link closely to the programmes and evaluation team as well, around understanding, for example, movement hubs, where they bring together some key people within sectors and policymakers and bring that together with our evidence strands as well. So there's much or quite a lot of activity that are happening within the change team also. So please do keep an eye out for that as well, because we inherently link together to be able to understand how we can take what works into the scaling up piece.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, I think we don't have any more questions coming through to chat. So I think if it's okay, I'll leave it to Sarah to decide, but we could potentially end here. But Sarah, I'll let you take the lead on that.
Thanks so much, Kaylin. Thank you to Yasmin as well, and thank you for everyone on here. Kaylin, I think you'll reach out to people with a PDF maybe of the presentation, so you can all have a copy of that as well. We'll also share the recording, so if you want to share that amongst your teams and partners, please do so. Just a massive thank you again. It's great to see you all and great to have your questions, and do reach out if there's anything further you'd like to ask us. And thanks so much. Have a wonderful week.